I've got some troubling news about England's royal family.
Princess Anne did not expect a family confrontation when she entered Balmoral's private library. But the moment she found members of Camilla's family inside a room traditionally guarded from casual access, everything changed. Within minutes, Anne confronted them. Camilla was summoned, and King Charles made an extraordinary decision. Balmoral Castle was locked down, departures were halted, and access to the royal library was immediately suspended. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Anne froze for only a moment before disbelief overtook surprise. Balmoral was not simply another royal residence to her brother. It was the Scottish retreat, where generations of the family had gathered, grieved, celebrated, and guarded memories that never belonged to the public. The private library, a restricted room containing inherited books, personal correspondence, historical volumes, and family possessions, carried even greater weight. Yet several members of Camilla's family were standing inside, without a senior royal beside them. Anne looked directly at them and asked one question. Who had given permission? The answer came slowly, uncertainly, and her disbelief hardened into anger. Charles was speaking elsewhere in the castle when the message reached him. He stopped in the middle of a sentence, removed his glasses, and placed them carefully on the table. The gesture was calm. The emotion beneath it was not. To the king, this was not about people touching old books. It was about whether the boundaries inside his own home still meant anything. Camilla was summoned immediately, and she arrived knowing only that her relatives had been discovered somewhere they should not have been. She watched his face, but he offered no accusation. Instead, he asked exactly where they had been found and whether anyone had authorized their entry. A staff member then delivered the detail that changed the atmosphere. The door had not been forced. There was no broken lock, no damaged cabinet, no sign that anyone had slipped inside secretly. According to a documented household account, someone appeared to have allowed them access. That possibility disturbed Anne even more. If the relatives had not broken into the room, then somebody within Balmoral had opened a path for them. Charles understood the danger immediately. He ordered the estate locked down, meaning departures were temporarily stopped while household movements were checked. The library was sealed, staff access was reviewed, and everyone connected to the incident was told to remain available. Camilla stood silent as the order spread through the house. Charles still refused to blame her, but he would not soften the response either. Then Anne stepped closer and told her brother something he had not expected. This was not the first time Camilla's family had shown unusual interest in that library. She had noticed questions before, small moments that had seemed harmless at the time. Charles looked at her, suddenly understanding that the discovery might have begun long before that afternoon. He had locked the doors to find out who crossed the line, but Anne was about to explain why she feared that line had been approached weeks earlier. The lockdown was dramatic, but the real danger inside Balmoral was emotional. Charles now faced the woman he had built his later life around, the sister whose loyalty had rarely wavered, and relatives connected to Camilla, who suddenly stood at the center of an intensely private royal breach. Nobody in that triangle could retreat without losing something, and Anne understood that before anyone else did. Charles felt the weight of Balmoral in a way few others could. To him, the estate carried memories of childhood, his mother, and the years when the burden of succession slowly became real. Succession simply means the line by which the crown passes from one monarch to the next, and Balmoral had always been one of the places where that burden felt most personal. That was why the library mattered. It was not just another room. It was part of a private world he believed had been protected by trust. Anne understood that instinctively because she had spent decades knowing when her brother needed comfort, and when he needed the truth delivered without softness. Camilla entered the room tense and defensive. She did not begin with an apology. She asked whether her family was being treated like suspects, Charles looked at her carefully and refused to give the reassurance she wanted. He told her nobody had been accused, but nobody would be cleared until he understood how the access had happened. Anne watched the exchange and immediately sensed the danger. If she pushed too hard, she risked making this look personal. If she softened it, she risked allowing the central issue to disappear beneath family loyalty. Anne lowered her voice. She told Camilla this was not about blood, marriage, or old resentment. It was about a boundary that had been ignored. Then she added the detail Charles had not yet heard. According to a documented household account, one of Camilla's relatives had asked a member of staff several days earlier whether older family volumes could be viewed privately. Those books were stored away from general guest areas because some contained personal annotations and inherited family material. Charles immediately turned toward the Queen Consort. Camilla's expression changed. Camilla remembered the conversation. She had heard something similar in passing and had dismissed it as harmless curiosity. Now that memory felt dangerous. Charles asked her directly whether she had personally authorized anyone to enter the library. She answered no. The king said nothing. He simply studied her face for several long seconds, and the silence struck harder than accusation. Anne finally broke it. She told them this was not the first warning. Weeks earlier, the same curiosity had already triggered a confrontation. One she had mentioned at the time, and one Charles had chosen not to pursue. Camilla looked at her sharply. The king leaned forward. Suddenly, the question was no longer simply who had entered the library. It was why the warning signs had been allowed to build until Anne finally found someone behind the forbidden door. Weeks before Balmoral was locked, the crisis had almost announced itself. At a private family gathering, an apparently harmless question about the castle's restricted rooms had caused Anne to stop a conversation cold. Nobody treated the exchange as a major warning then. Now Charles was forced to reconsider it, because one forgotten conversation had become the exact trigger everyone wished they had taken seriously. Anne had noticed the tension building before anyone wanted to name it. Camilla had worked hard to make Balmoral feel warmer and less distant for her relatives, believing family familiarity could soften the rigid edges of royal life. Royal protocol, the set of formal rules and customs governing how the monarchy operates, often creates distance, even inside private homes. But Balmoral was different for Charles. It carried inherited responsibilities as well as memories, and some rooms were kept private because they held personal papers, annotated books, and material tied directly to earlier generations of the family. Camilla believed kindness could prevent resentment. Anne feared kindness without limits could create confusion. 3 weeks earlier, during a private tea, one of the Queen Consort's relatives asked whether the old library still contained Queen Elizabeth II's annotated books and personal family papers. The question changed Anne's mood instantly. She replied that certain rooms were not available to guests, and ended the conversation there. The relative backed away from the subject, but the Princess Royal did not forget the interest behind it. Anne later told Charles exactly what had been said. He listened, but he did not want another argument between the two sides of the family. The king told his sister that curiosity was not wrongdoing and asked her not to turn a small exchange into a larger dispute. She left frustrated, but respected his decision. Camilla, unaware of how seriously Anne had taken the question, continued believing the matter had disappeared. It had not. Charles remembered that conversation now with painful clarity. He looked at his sister and finally admitted what pride had prevented him from saying earlier. "I should have listened." Anne's anger softened, but only slightly. A documented household account then deepened the problem. A steward confirmed that the same relative had later asked whether the library could be entered when the monarch was away from that part of the castle. The next discovery was worse. Staff could find no written authorization in the household log, the record used to track important access and movements inside the residence. If permission had been given, it appeared to have been verbal. That meant someone had opened the door without leaving a clear record of who made the decision. Charles ended the speculation there. He asked Anne and Camilla to remain with him when the relatives were brought in. This time, he would not rely on assumptions or second-hand explanations. The forgotten warning had become impossible to ignore, and now the people found inside the library would have to explain themselves directly to the king. There were no advisors between them when Charles finally demanded an explanation. Anne stood beside him. Camilla sat opposite, caught between husband and family. Then the relatives discovered inside Balmoral's library entered the room. What followed was not a shouting match but something colder. A king asking precise questions, a sister refusing to soften what she had witnessed, and a queen realizing every answer carried consequences. Charles had deliberately kept the meeting small. He did not want layers of staff, competing accounts, or royal protocol shielding anyone from the truth. Protocol in this context meant the formal rules and procedures that normally structure conversations around the monarch. This time, the king wanted none of that distance. Anne repeated exactly what she had seen. The library door open, Camilla's relatives inside, and one of them standing beside shelves that were not meant for ordinary guests. The details were simple. That made them harder to dismiss. One relative spoke first. No harm had been intended, they insisted. They believed permission had already been granted. Anne responded immediately. By whom? The answer did not come. A pause stretched across the room, and Charles noticed it. Camilla noticed it too. The queen consort's distress became obvious as the king asked whether anyone had used her position as an implied form of permission. She rejected the suggestion at once. She would never knowingly allow her family to walk into a restricted room simply because they were connected to her. The explanation became more complicated. According to a recorded conversation, later summarized in the household account, a member of staff had apparently said the library could be viewed briefly, but nobody could repeat the exact words, and nobody knew whether that casual approval included the private shelves Anne had found them beside. Charles pressed again. Were they simply looking around? The answer changed everything. No. They had been searching for a particular volume connected to royal family history. Anne pushed her chair back. Her patience was gone. She asked why that specific book mattered. Charles raised one hand, not to stop his sister, but to make certain nobody interrupted the response. The relative finally explained that they had heard about the volume during an earlier family conversation and believed it contained personal annotations from previous generations. Camilla went still. She knew immediately which conversation they meant. Charles turned toward her. The king did not accuse her, but the silence between them became heavier than anything said so far. The queen remembered discussing the old book casually, never imagining that anyone would later try to see it. Anne watched her reaction and understood the breach had just become far more complicated. The confrontation had exposed how the family entered the library, but the next question was far more dangerous. Had Camilla unknowingly set the entire chain of events in motion? Balmoral belonged to the crown, but this decision belonged to Charles. He could treat what happened as an embarrassing family misunderstanding and reopen the castle before nightfall. Or he could enforce a boundary that would inevitably wound Camilla. Sitting between duty and marriage, the king faced the kind of choice monarchy rarely makes easy. Protect peace inside the family, or protect the rules that give the institution its meaning. Charles knew the problem had moved beyond one open door. As sovereign, meaning the reigning monarch with final authority over his own royal household and private working spaces, he carried responsibility for who entered areas tied to the crown. Anne made that point without hesitation. She warned that if informal permission was accepted once, future guests could claim the same excuse whenever a restricted boundary became inconvenient. To her, the issue was not punishment, it was precedent. The king understood exactly what she meant, and that made the decision heavier. Camilla asked to speak with him privately. She did not defend the mistake itself. She told Charles her relatives had acted foolishly, but she insisted they had not entered the library with malicious intent. The queen consort feared something different now: humiliation. She knew a severe response could make her family feel publicly marked by a mistake that had begun as curiosity. He listened without interrupting. Then he told her quietly that he believed her. Charles looked exhausted rather than angry. That hurt Camilla more. He explained that belief did not remove responsibility, especially now that the disputed volume had been identified. According to the documented household account, it was an old family reference book carrying handwritten annotations from previous generations. There were no explosive secrets inside it, but there were private observations and inherited notes never intended for casual guests. The king considered that distinction crucial. Privacy did not become meaningless simply because the material was not scandalous. The truth became clearer. Charles learned that Camilla had mentioned the volume during an informal family conversation days earlier. She had described it casually, never inviting anyone to retrieve it, but the conversation explained how her relatives knew the book existed. The queen accepted that connection immediately. She had not opened the library door, but she could no longer deny that her words had helped create the curiosity behind it. Charles asked to be left alone. For several minutes, he read the access report again, closed it, and placed his pen across the cover. Then, he made the decision. The lockdown would continue until staff procedures were reconstructed, and Camilla's relatives agreed to leave the private wing completely. The ruling protected his wife from direct blame, but it also ended something else. Her family would no longer enjoy the informal freedom they had assumed inside Balmoral. Charles had avoided accusing Camilla, yet his decision still landed inside her family like a verdict, and the first consequences came almost immediately. The gates remained controlled, the library stayed sealed, and the relatives at the center of the crisis were told their access had changed. But for Camilla, the hardest consequence was not procedural. It was personal. She had spent years trying to balance two families under the pressure of the crown, and now a room inside Balmoral had become proof that those worlds could collide in a single afternoon. Camilla received the revised rules alone. Charles had ordered that every private royal room now required direct household authorization, meaning clear approval from the senior staff responsible for controlling access, no matter how close a guest was to the king or queen. Her relatives were not publicly accused, and they were not expelled in disgrace. They were simply moved away from the restricted wing and told that informal access would no longer be assumed. The decision was measured. That almost made it harder. She knew Charles believed she had not ordered the entry, yet he still had to tighten the rules because of people she loved. Camilla sat in silence after the aide left. Anger had faded into embarrassment, and embarrassment had become something closer to grief. She had spent years trying to prove that her family could exist beside royal life without threatening it. Now one mistake had created exactly the suspicion she had feared. The queen consort understood why Charles acted, but understanding did not remove the humiliation. She was still carrying the weight of consequences she had not directly caused. Anne chose not to avoid her. She entered expecting resistance and found it immediately. Camilla accused the Princess Royal of turning careless curiosity into something dangerously close to a constitutional drama. Anne did not flinch. She said she would have reacted exactly the same way if the people inside that library had been her own children. Her concern was not whose family had crossed the boundary. It was the fact that the boundary had been crossed at all. Camilla finally admitted something she had been resisting. During dinner days earlier, she had mentioned the old volume herself. She had spoken casually, never expecting anyone to search for it, but she now understood how that conversation had encouraged the interest that followed. Anne listened, then gave her something unexpected in return. According to her documented account of the discovery, none of the relatives had been hiding papers, concealing objects, or trying to remove anything. Her fear had always been about access, not theft. Camilla's expression changed. For the first time, she stopped asking whether her family had broken a rule, and asked the question that actually frightened her. Did Charles believe she had betrayed his trust? Anne answered carefully. He believes you. He is frightened by what the breach means. That was enough. Camilla knew the next conversation could no longer be delayed. The lockdown had punished assumption rather than treachery, but she still needed to hear from Charles whether their marriage had survived the suspicions surrounding it. After hours of controlled doors, careful statements, and unanswered questions, Charles and Camilla finally faced each other alone. No sisters stood beside him. No relatives waited outside to defend themselves. No advisor shaped the language. The Balmoral crisis had become painfully simple. Did the king believe his wife? And could the queen accept that protecting their marriage did not mean protecting her family from every consequence? Charles asked for complete privacy because he wanted the personal questions separated from the household investigation. That investigation meant the internal review of who had entered the restricted rooms, who had granted access, and whether normal procedures had been ignored. He did not want staff reports between them now. He wanted truth. Camilla entered prepared to defend her family again, but the anger she expected was missing. The king looked tired, almost wounded, and that immediately changed her tone. Camilla told him what the lockdown had made her feel. She said every time something went wrong around the monarchy, people connected to her were treated like outsiders first, and family second. The queen consort had spent years trying to close that distance, and now one mistake had reopened it in a single day. Charles listened without interruption. Then he answered with the one distinction he needed her to understand. He had not locked Balmoral because they were her relatives. He had locked it because Anne found unauthorized people inside a private room he would have protected from anyone. Charles then removed the doubt that had been hanging over them. He told Camilla clearly that he did not believe she instructed anyone to enter the library. He did not believe she deliberately used her position to open a door. The queen absorbed the words slowly, because they ended the suspicion she had feared most. But relief came with responsibility. She admitted that her casual discussion of the old volume had blurred a boundary, even if she never imagined anyone would act on it. Camilla agreed her relatives would follow the same restrictions as every other guest from that point forward. No implied permission, no assumptions based on family closeness. Charles accepted the promise, but he did not soften the rule. The king wanted Balmoral reopened only after the new access procedures were fully in place and everyone understood them. Charles finally reached across the table and took her hand. He waited until the issue was settled before doing it. The gesture was not an escape from accountability. It was proof that accountability had not destroyed trust. Together, they agreed Anne had been right to intervene. The private fracture had begun to mend, but Balmoral was not yet ready to return to normal. Before the gates could fully reopen, word of the extraordinary lockdown was about to escape the estate, and the public would decide what it represented. By the next morning, what had begun inside a private library was no longer private. The image dominating discussion was brutally simple. Balmoral, the royal family's Scottish refuge, placed under temporary restriction after Anne discovered members of Camilla's family inside a protected room. To some, the lockdown looked ruthless. To others, it looked like Charles proving that marriage, blood, and friendship could not override royal boundaries. Charles knew the public story could become more dangerous than the private mistake. Palace communications stressed that the restriction was temporary and connected to an internal access review, meaning a formal check of who entered certain rooms and how permission had been granted. There had been no threat to the king, no attack, and no evidence of anything being taken. Yet the debate had already split sharply. Some believed the monarch had overreacted to a family misunderstanding. Others argued Anne had stopped something far more serious: the slow collapse of boundaries inside a royal residence where trust mattered as much as locks. Camilla felt the humiliation she had feared from the beginning. She saw her relatives reduced in public discussion to symbols of privilege, as if their connection to the queen consort had allowed them to walk anywhere without consequence. She knew the truth was more complicated, but she also knew Charles could not reverse his decision just to make the headlines kinder. Anne felt uneasy for a different reason. The Princess Royal had become a public hero to people who praised her firmness, yet she knew the intervention had strained her brother's marriage before it finally strengthened the rules around it. The story reached its most dramatic public moment, when a fictional morning newspaper appeared with one huge headline: Balmoral sealed. Anne's discovery forces king to act. A small crowd gathered near the Balmoral gates, and the conversation turned from scandal to symbolism. Had Anne simply protected a library, or had she defended the idea that even royal relatives must stop when a boundary is marked? Charles understood why that question mattered. The monarchy depended not only on ceremony, but on the belief that rules applied inward as well as outward. Then the palace issued the clarification that changed the tone. Nothing had been removed from the library. No papers, books, or private objects were missing. Charles also authorized a concise statement explaining that Camilla's relatives had acted on misunderstood informal permission, but that private royal areas would now operate under stricter controls. Camilla accepted the statement. Anne accepted it too. The facts were finally settled, but Charles still faced the hardest decision of all. Once the noise outside Balmoral faded, the king was left with the consequence that mattered most: whether this crisis would become another royal wound, or the moment his family finally understood where trust must end and duty begins. When Charles finally ordered Balmoral reopened, he did not pretend nothing had happened. That was the significance of the entire crisis. Anne had exposed a boundary that had become dangerously informal. Camilla had been forced to confront the consequences of allowing family familiarity to blur royal rules. And Charles had discovered that protecting his marriage sometimes required refusing to protect everyone around it from accountability. Charles ended the temporary restrictions only after the household access procedures had been rewritten. Those procedures were the internal rules controlling who could enter private royal rooms and who had authority to grant permission. Staff responsibilities were clarified. The library returned to its protected status, and the confusion that had allowed informal access was removed. Camilla's relatives left Balmoral without accusations of theft or malicious intent, but they left with one unmistakable lesson: closeness to the queen consort did not create unrestricted access to the private world of the crown. Charles then spoke privately with Anne. He thanked his sister for acting quickly and admitted that her intervention had stopped a smaller mistake from becoming something far more damaging. The king also acknowledged the warning he had dismissed weeks earlier. Anne did not celebrate being proven right. She told him she had never wanted Camilla humiliated or her relatives publicly shamed. The Princess Royal had wanted only one thing: the boundary protected. Her brother accepted that distinction, and the tension that had grown between them finally began to disappear. Camilla made her own decision. She agreed with Charles that future family visits would follow formal household permission without exception. The Queen no longer saw that rule as a punishment aimed at her relatives. She understood it as protection, for the king, for the monarchy, and ultimately for her own family as well. Charles made his answer equally clear when he asked her to remain beside him at Balmoral after her relatives departed. He had separated their mistake from his trust in his wife. Charles returned to the library with Anne and Camilla beside him. He paused at the door, closed it himself, and handed the key to the household official responsible for access. The gesture carried the final verdict. From that moment forward, Responsibility would decide who crossed that threshold, not relationships, assumptions, or family privilege. The crisis ended without a villain. That was what made the lesson harder and more powerful. Anne's loyalty mattered because she was willing to create discomfort. Camilla preserved trust because she accepted accountability. Charles emerged stronger because he refused to choose between love and duty when integrity could be demanded from both. Balmoral reopened, the family remained intact, and the library door stopped being the symbol of a royal crisis. It became the symbol of its solution. Trust could survive mistakes, but only when privilege stopped at the threshold of responsibility. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.